Hey, are you ready for another crappy low-budget movie from the 60s and 70s? I'm not, but we're talking about one anyway. It's because this one was public domain, so that meant that it was free to find on YouTube, so... yeah, that's pretty much the only reason why we're talking about this movie.
We are certain the force of this detonation will rupture the faults of the Earth's surface and set up a chain reaction of explosions at the Earth's center. 2, 1. Ground control to Astra. Everything is A-OK from here.
What is it?
How many movies have I done that were like this? Alright, I can only find a couple of movies where we talked about stuff like this, like Manos, Screaming Skull, and The Terror, and so now we're talking about Doomsday Machine. Following the discovery of a Doomsday Machine capable of destroying Earth, the launch of a US space mission to Venus is taken over by the military. Now, surprisingly, this has an even lower score than Turkish Star Wars, which we talked about last time. This has 2.6 out of 10 on IMDb, and it has 5% on Rotten Tomatoes. Fuck, that's low. That's lower than any of the other, like, vintage bad movies we've talked about on this show. Holy shit. So from what I can gather, this movie was originally filmed in 1967, it sat on the shelf for a long time, and then they eventually released it in 1972. Why? I don't know. I guess someone had big ideas for Doomsday Machine, so they had to sit on it until they eventually got it right. And the end result... this movie fucking sucked. Even as someone who enjoys older movies because they might have a slower pace to them and because they might be a little bit more character heavy or dialogue heavy, movies like this and The Terror and The Screaming Skull are total schlock. And you know what? Out of all those movies, I'm kind of surprised that Manos: The Hands of Fate and The Screaming Skull were the only ones that ended up on Mystery Science Theater. I gotta say, if you haven't seen this movie yet, this has all the hallmarks of a movie that would have landed on MST3K. Bad acting, boring pacing, bad production, dated 60s and 70s bullshit. It would have been perfect.
My turtle died.
I want to live. I want to live!
Surprise! There's got to be easier ways to get Alice Cooper tickets.
So what is Doomsday Machine about? Well, it starts at some kind of hidden research facility, and we have some spies. There's two of them, a man and a woman. They're sneaking around. Also a scene where they have to take out a lady scientist, so the lady spy grabs her like ponytail or one of her pigtails or whatever and chokes her out until she passes out on the floor. It happens, but these spies, they go wandering around and they come across the titular Doomsday Machine, which looks like, I don't know, a robot out of the old 60s Doctor Who show. That or a giant version of one of those old remote control Omnidroid robot toys from the 80s. It kind of looked like that. But they put it in a cage, and they're trying to get information on this Doomsday Machine because apparently they're plotting to destroy the world. Then we cut over to a military base, which is specifically designed for space travel. So move over, NASA. Get out of the way, SpaceX. You got competition from Astra. And they're doing this big press conference and talking about how they're planning to launch a couple of astronauts into space. And what's really weird about this whole sequence is while they're doing the presentation, they keep getting interrupted by someone over the intercom. Like, periodically, they're trying to talk, they'll stop, and then obviously they did that because it's a movie. They're like, okay, character stops talking. Then someone on intercom starts talking. But it just feels weird. It's like, why would you do that in a press conference. Like,
Our probes of the outer solar system, all these efforts have helped prepare us for the payoff of Phase 1, putting man on Venus.
Attention. Countdown is resumed from T-minus 120. Repeat. Countdown is resumed from T-minus 120.
the pacing of it is so comical, it felt like something out of an old Abrams Zucker's movie. It felt like something you'd see out of, like, Airplane or Naked Gun.
The red zone has always been for loading and unloading. There's never stopping in a white zone.
Don't tell me which zone is for stopping and which zone is for loading.
Listen, Betty, don't start up with your white zone shit again.
But then we get this gem of an exchange.
Well, what do you consider unusual circumstances?
Anything we're not prepared for.
Isn't that a little redundant? You know, what do you consider strange and unusual? Things we're not prepared for? Isn't that kind of self-explanatory? Then at the last second, the government says that they want to add a couple of special additions to their space travel, and they're going to be sending a few more astronauts to be traveling with them, and they just so happen to be women astronauts.
You are to replace 3 of your crew with 3 other officers.
Women? Now I've heard everything.
Colonel, this is ridiculous. It's absolutely insane.
Gentlemen, I don't understand.
And believe me, that's just the beginning of the uncomfortability, because this movie loves to promote that whole battle of the sexes, men versus women shit all throughout this movie. And then you get stuff like this.
Now, supposing China did destroy the world, there'd be nothing left for us to come back to.
Oh, come on, Doc, you're space happy. You've been reading the pulps again. Doomsday? Get him. Well, I mean, you guys aren't taking him seriously, are you? Those chopstick jockeys couldn't come off with a planet buster, could they?
I did consider stopping the movie at that point. And I figured, I've talked about worse movies. And if I could sit through all of Turkish Star Wars and not understand it and still do a review of it, like hell, I'm gonna give up on Doomsday Machine. So once they get up into space, we then get to see the awesome set design that's in the movie, with a lot of the late 60s, early 70s bad sci-fi movie hallmarks when it comes to the set design. You know, big computers, they just have like those old big box computers that take up a wall, and you know, you got the consoles with the keyboards and the knobs and the glowing buttons and shit like that. But the weirdest thing about the set design is it looks like they're projecting colors onto the walls. I don't know if they were doing that because they thought it looked scientific or, you know, for aesthetics reasons or whatever, but it was just weird. It looks like they were like projecting the colors of the rainbow on the walls. It was really distracting.
Doc, you got us back on course again. All we have to do is slide down your orbit, 4 months of free fall, and we're home.
My favorite thing too, when they're initially taking off, the chairs that they're sitting in are recliners. I also love how they tried to distinguish the men and the women in this movie, because the men, you know, they get along pretty well. It's like they've worked together for so long. You know, they seem to be like, you know, oh, we're the big burly men of the machine. You know, we're astronaut men. And the ladies, I believe they said that they were scientists. So, you know, they don't really have astronaut training, but they are scientists. So they try to make them as like, oh, they're smart and independent young women, but they're also super sexy.
We're only doing what we were ordered to do, and if it doesn't suit you, well, I'm very sorry.
You know, without your glasses, you're a very pretty doctor.
All 3 of the women, the one that they try to make the most like, oh, she's like a spitfire, she's a sassy lady, she's actually a Russian American, and she talks about how, like, you know, things are different in Russia. Once again, going back to the real cheap-ass production of this movie, the costumes that they have them wearing are, no joke, the colors of pink, green, and blue. So the entire time I was thinking, they look like they're dressed up in adult costumes for the Powerpuff Girls. That whole part is just so weird because Powerpuff Girls didn't even exist at that point. Powerpuff Girls wasn't even a thing, a concept. It was just floating around in space-time waiting to be created. So once they're in space, they start talking, and the male astronauts are talking amongst themselves about how they might be the last humans left because they heard that the Chinese government was apparently plotting to destroy the world and begin nuclear war. And guess what? Shock of shock, it turns out to be true, because then they look through like a little pair of binoculars that look down on Earth, and you see, you know, floods and buildings collapsing and all out war, and then the planet just blows up. And by that I mean it looks like they got a little like ping pong ball or something and lit it on fire and showed it for 2 seconds.
What is it?
My God. They did it.
It's happened. Nuclear war.
That's just one of the many examples of how awesome the editing in this movie is, because the uncomfortability just continues, and not in a way where it's like, you look at something like Apollo 13, you have moments in that where it's like, things are obviously uncomfortable, you know, space madness, that kind of thing. And if this movie was written better, maybe it could have portrayed something like that in an entertaining way, in an interesting and compelling way, but no, this movie, the best way to describe it is, it's like the most uncomfortable late 60s, early 70s softcore porn ever, because there's just constant tension where the male astronauts are trying to flirt with their female counterparts. And
would you care to join me on a tour of the ship? See what makes it tick?
And they start like making out, and then there's parts later on where like she's trying to get away from him, and he ain't taking no for an answer. This one guy out of all of them, this one guy, he was not taking no for an answer, and it's really fucking uncomfortable.
Don't. Don't your vibrations ever stop?
You know it has to be sooner or later.
The only other movie I can think of that felt like this is a movie called Spaced Out, which I think that came around the late 70s or early 80s maybe. But it was a sci-fi sex comedy about a bunch of astronauts that go up into space and they start having sex with one another.
Now, would you remove your remaining garment, please? I have to have a visual record of the small vestigial limb located beneath your stomach. It's of great interest to us.
A vegetable?
I have to take measurements.
Measurements?
The one difference between this movie and that movie is that movie was at least meant to be a comedy. This wasn't. And so the fact that everyone was taking what they were doing so seriously added to the uncomfortability. Here's another problem with this movie. Just like a lot of these old school movies I've reviewed, stuff like Manos or Screaming Skull or The Terror, it's really boring in the middle of the movie. There are just dry spells where a lot of it is just people talking. And I like movies where you have a lot of dialogue-heavy scenes, but this is one of those old movies where the movie's not written well enough. And the more the movie plays out, where you start to see people slowly lose their self-control and start to become more animalistic and crazy and space-happy, the entire time I'm like, man, it's saying something when a 7-minute episode of Ren and Stimpy did this way better than this movie did.
I believe my own partner attacked me. Maybe, if I occupy his mind with more duties, I can control his space madness.
Because at one point the one guy who was getting really fucking aggressive, he tries to force himself onto the one lady astronaut, and then she pushes him away, and then he hits her, and then you know, some of his cohorts, they show up and they're like, hey, settle down, and then they just get into an all-out fist fight.
God's sakes, cool it, Mason. What are you trying to do?
Take your hands off her.
Bring it up! Mason, I've had it with you!
So as everything starts to go all Lord of the Flies on the ship, the guy who's being aggressive and unnecessarily touchy-feely, and the woman he keeps lusting after, they end up going into a part of the ship that has a hatch opening, and they start to get into a squabble with each other, and then a button ends up getting pressed, and then you just see them like slowly float around on strings, acting like they're suffocating in the vacuum of space. Completely ignore the fact that realistically they would have just gotten sucked right out of there because it is, after all, the vacuum of space. But, you know, it was 1967 when they made this, so they couldn't do that back then. Nowadays it would have been obvious CG and it probably would have looked ridiculous, but Actually, no, fuck it. It still looks ridiculous here, because it's just them floating around slowly going, and like fake blood going out their eyes. And they don't get sucked out at all. They just kind of float around until they're declared dead by the other characters. So now with 2 of their crew dead, everyone starts to wonder what they should do, and they consult the computer as to who should go. But then something starts to malfunction on the ship, so 2 of them have to go out and fix it, and this takes way too fucking long. But believe me, we're going to get more scenes where it gets unnecessarily long, because while they're out there trying to fix the ship from the outside, they see a space station not too far away, so they float towards it, and then they get on board, and they try to crack into the computer system, and it's just one static shot of them sitting there, typing away on the computer. This scene goes on for like probably 10 minutes at least. Like it's so unnecessarily long. It's just one static shot. It is like, all right, you are trying to drag this fucking movie out now, man. Like, there may have been some boring dialogue heavy scenes in the middle of the movie, but nothing beats this. I admit I did start to fast forward a little bit because it was going on way too long, unnecessarily long, painfully long. So I fast forwarded a bit, and really the end of the movie has them getting some kind of audio message from some advanced alien race that they of course never show. And they're talking to them about how, oh, they're the last survivors of the human race. And
your time is short. You may not enter our world. We have witnessed the self-destructive powers of the green planet you call Earth. We have no malice toward you. You have destroyed your place in the universe.
And how they can be the ones to repopulate the human species, and how there's some kind of perfect world waiting for them, but, you know, they need to prove themselves, and maybe one day they can get there. And then the movie just kind of awkwardly stops. What happened? Did they die off? Did they get to prove themselves and go to this new perfect world and restart humanity? It was at that point where I was like, fuck it, I don't care anymore. And how appropriate that we're talking about this movie in the same year that I also talked about Battle Space, which was a crappy 2000s straight-to-video sci-fi movie that was also painfully boring. But at least with that movie, I later found out that it was a huge passion project for the person that made it. So that kind of explained a little bit about what was going on. It didn't explain a whole lot, but I at least understood that, okay, someone really wanted to make this movie. Behind the scenes footage kind of explained why it exists. This, on the other hand, just kind of feels like any garden variety, dime a dozen, forgettable sci-fi B-movie from that time. And the biggest problem with it, aside from being incredibly dated and uncomfortable, is that it's fucking boring. A lot of the dialogue-heavy scenes, I could just kind of write off like, okay, yeah, lots of scenes of people talking. That's kind of how a lot of these old movies from the 60s and 70s were. But if they were good and well-written, you could look past that kind of thing, and that was usually what carried the movie. And when you get to the last 15, 20 minutes, it's dull. It's really dull, to the point where you just want to fast forward. It's like, all right, something fucking happened. It's Manos the Hands of Fate levels, man. It's seriously Manos levels, where you're just like, all right, somebody fucking do something. There's no way I could recommend people actually sit down and watch something like Screaming Skull or The Terror or something like this. But if you're into watching bad movies and making fun of bad movies, yeah, this one's right up your alley. I feel like this one, I mean, I guess you could say more stuff happened in this than the Screaming Skull, but I mean, Screaming Skull also didn't have much happening in it either. And The Terror at least had star power. That had Boris Karloff and a young Jack Nicholson. If you can tolerate really shitty old 60s and 70s science fiction movies, yeah, I'd say watch this one just based on the fact that you can make fun of it. I mean, there's plenty to make fun of. It really did feel like prime MST3K material. But if you're just looking for a movie to just casually watch, you know, just watch at your leisure, no. Don't watch this piece of shit. I'm tempted to say that Turkish Star Wars was better because while I didn't understand what was going on in it until I watched the behind-the-scenes documentary videos that talked about that, at least that movie was so bad it was funny just based on how balls to the wall and insane it was. This movie was dull. It really did feel like the most uncomfortable 60s or 70s softcore porn with a science fiction theme added to it. But, yeah, I think that's all that really needs to be said about Doomsday Machine. As for what's coming next on Blockbuster Show, I'm going to be talking about a variety of different movies. I'm going to be doing another movie marathon video. And we're going to be talking about some crappy-ass knockoff movies from the Asylum. I actually didn't know the Asylum were still making stuff, but it turns out they actually are. Back then, me and my friends watched some of these movies, and I don't think we really knew who the Asylum were yet, but many years went by, and it's like, alright, I think we all know who the Asylum are. They were known for crappy knockoff movies that were aping off the success of big Hollywood summer blockbusters. They made really crappy, low-budget monster movies that would go to Sci-Fi Channel, and more specifically, I think a lot of people would recognize them for the Sharknado movies. But that's for next time. Until then, guys, I'm Adam Sykes of the Blockbuster Show, and we will see you guys in the next video.
I don't believe it.
You know, there must be a practical side to having women.
You mean like having your socks washed?